My name is Martha. I'm a 72-year-old retired history teacher. I had to watch as my son-in-law's family, a powerful and cruel dynasty, pushed my daughter into the icy waters of Lake Tahoe just for their own amusement. They left her to drown, brushed aside my pleas, and called it a bit of theater. But they made one fatal mistake. This isn't just a story of revenge. This is the calculated dismantling of a rotten empire, orchestrated from the quiet corners of hospital waiting rooms and a suburban kitchen. If you've ever felt helpless watching a loved one get hurt, stay with this story, because none of us should have to fight alone. That evening, at the Brown Palace Hotel, I wasn't just a guest. I was an unwilling historian, witnessing the first signs of a decline and fall. The Brown Palace Hotel is a monument in itself. Built in the 19th century, it carries the dignity of a bygone era, with its soaring atrium and intricate wrought iron balconies. But the crowd gathering in the ballroom that night belonged to a different age. They were the conquerors of the 21st century. Their weapons were stock portfolios and connections bought with money. I, in the deep blue silk dress that Amy had insisted on buying for me, felt like a sparrow that had wandered into a flock of preening peacocks. I hated events like this, not for the luxury, but for the artificiality. Everything from the crystal chandeliers that sparkled like 1,000 frozen tears to the laughter calculated to echo just loud enough was a performance. And in this play, my daughter Amelia was playing a role she never chose. I sat at a table tucked away in a corner, a position that allowed me to observe without being noticed. It's a habit from a lifetime as a history teacher. Always find the vantage point with the best view of the whole picture. From here, I had a clear view of the stage, where Walter Croft, my daughter's father-in-law, stood like a Roman emperor bestowing favors upon the masses. Walter was a large man, his salt and pepper hair meticulously trimmed, his expensive suit hugging a frame that was still powerful in his 70s. His voice was deep and resonant, each word released with the weight of authority. "Legacy," he boomed, one hand raised in the air, a gold signet ring flashing on his pinky finger. "It isn't what we leave to our children, it's what we leave in them. The values of family, of community, of responsibility." I almost laughed out loud. Values. Walter Croft talking about values was like a butcher talking about compassion. His laugh, which I'd had to endure for the past 10 years, had the metallic tang of money. His generosity always came with invisible strings attached, and his so-called family love was a form of despotic ownership. I glanced over at his son Julian, my daughter's husband. Julian stood just below the stage, looking up at his father with a practiced, smug smile that was perfected to a fault. He had the blonde hair, the blue eyes, and all the superficial charm that money could buy. But behind those eyes was a terrifying emptiness, a bottomless well of narcissism. His arm was draped casually around the waist of some young, beautiful businesswoman who was looking at him with pure admiration. And then I saw my daughter, my Amy. She stood a few feet away from Julian, like a faint satellite orbiting a brilliant but cold planet. She was wearing a shimmering silver evening gown, a dress that must have cost a fortune, but it seemed to swallow her whole, turning her into an expensive coat hanger. The smile on her face was so fragile, like a butterfly pinned to a display board. She was holding Julian's champagne glass. When Walter finished his speech to thunderous applause, Julian turned, and without so much as a glance at his wife, he handed the empty glass to Amy, a slight flick of his chin. "Get me another." It was such a small gesture, an act that probably no one else in that room even noticed. But to me, it was like a bolt of lightning. It was absolute contempt. Not a word, not a look, just an unspoken command. My Amy, the girl I had raised on stories of heroines, the daughter with the soul of an artist, was now taking that empty glass with a resigned nod and quietly slipping through the crowd to act as an unpaid servant for her husband. My heart clenched. This wasn't the life I wanted for her. This was a gilded cage, and my little canary was slowly forgetting how to sing. I watched Walter step down from the stage, sycophants swarming him like pilot fish around a shark. He walked over to Julian, slapping him hard on the back. "Well done, son," he said, his voice thick with pride. Then his sharp eyes scanned the room, finding Amy returning with 2 fresh glasses. He leaned in toward Julian, his voice a whisper, but I was focused enough, with a mother's intensity, that I could read his lips. Tell your wife to smile more. She looks like she's at a funeral." That slap, though invisible, made my own cheeks burn. I saw Amy approach and hand Julian the new glass. He took it, said something to her, and she immediately produced a brighter smile, but her eyes were vacant. She was performing. Her entire life with the Crofts was one long, unending performance, and I was afraid that one day she would forget what her own face truly looked like. I couldn't take it anymore. The air in the room was too thick. The smell of expensive perfume mingled with the stench of deceit was making me sick. I had to get out, if only for a few minutes. I rose quietly, slipping between the chairs and heading for the sign that read, "Ladies' Lounge." I needed some space, some silence, and a mirror to look at myself and ask why I had let things go this far. Interior. The hotel ladies' room, same night. The ladies' room at the Brown Palace was more luxurious than most people's living rooms. Italian marble floors, gleaming brass fixtures, and a long row of mirrors framed by small bulbs, giving you the feeling of being in a Hollywood star's dressing room from the Golden Age. The quiet in here was a relief, broken only by the soft trickle of water from a faucet not quite turned off. I walked to a sink, turned on the tap, and let the cool water run over my trembling fingers. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman with neatly pinned silver hair, the lines around her eyes a map of 72 years of life, and a deep, unconcealable sadness. The door opened softly, and I saw Patricia Croft walk in. Patricia, Walter's wife, Julian's mother. She had been a beauty queen once. I knew that from the old photographs. But the woman standing at the mirror now was just a shadow of her former self. She wore a fitted black velvet dress that showed off a still slender figure, but her every movement radiated a weary, resigned exhaustion. Her eyes, like Amy's, held a certain emptiness, but it wasn't the emptiness of someone trying to perform. It was the emptiness of someone who had given up a long, long time ago. She stood beside me at another mirror and began to fidget with the diamond bracelet on her left wrist. The large stones glittered under the lights, a piece of jewelry worth more than my entire house. But she didn't seem to be admiring it. She was restless, her thin fingers pulling at the bracelet as if it were bothering her. I decided to speak, my voice as gentle as I could make it. "That's a beautiful bracelet, Patricia." She jumped, as if my voice were a gunshot next to her ear. She quickly dropped her hand, but it was too late. In that brief moment when the bracelet slid up her arm, I had seen it. A bruise, blue and yellowing, an old bruise, right on the delicate bone of her wrist. It wasn't from an accidental bump. It was shaped like fingers, from a hand that had squeezed too tight. Patricia forced a smile that was even more twisted than Amy's. "Thank you, Martha," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was an anniversary gift from Walter." She quickly pulled the long sleeve of her dress down, trying to hide the evidence, but the image was already burned into my mind. An anniversary gift. The cruel irony of it was suffocating. I didn't look at her directly. I looked at our reflections in the mirror. Our eyes met in that flat, cold world. I saw a flash of panic in hers, the raw terror of a cornered animal. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "He seems..." I paused, letting the silence add weight to my words. "Very generous." I wasn't accusing. I was just observing. But in that space, between the two of us, the sentence carried a completely different meaning. It was an acknowledgement that I had seen, that I understood. I watched the defenses in Patricia's eyes crumble, replaced by a wave of pain and a humiliation that had been suppressed for decades. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She just quickly turned away, mechanically washed her hands, and then practically fled the room. The door swung shut behind her, leaving me alone with my reflection. My vague anxieties about Amy's happiness had now solidified into a concrete fear. This wasn't just a rich, arrogant, and unfeeling family. This was a toxic family, a family where the seeds of violence had taken root. The bruise on Patricia's wrist and the empty smile on Amy's face, they weren't two separate problems. They were symptoms of the same disease, a disease named Croft. This trip to Lake Tahoe wasn't my idea. Amy had called me, her voice on the phone wound with a forced cheerfulness, a happiness so over the top that only a mother could hear the crack beneath the surface. "Mom, Dad Croft wants the whole family together at the lodge for the weekend. It'll be so much fun. You have to come." The invitation sounded more like a plea. She was still trying, after 10 years, to build something called family from the shattered pieces of respect and the bricks of deceit. And because I love her, I went, carrying a heavy heart and a historian's premonition that I was about to witness a very ugly event. The Croft Lodge on the shore of Lake Tahoe wasn't a cozy cabin, it was a fortress. Built of stone and massive darkwood beams, it looked as if it had risen from the earth to dominate the landscape, not blend with it. The lawn was manicured to an absurd perfection. Not a single pine needle was allowed to be out of place. The giant plate glass windows, instead of opening up to the majestic view of the lake and the Sierra Nevada mountains, seemed more like cold, empty eyes, staring out but not really seeing anything. Even the air here felt different. The crisp scent of pine and damp earth seemed to be suffocated by something else, an invisible odor of arrogance and power. I sat in a wicker chair in a corner of the deck, slightly apart from the large table where the party was descending into a chaotic end. Walter and Julian had been drinking since noon. The bottles of expensive scotch emptied quickly, and as their blood alcohol levels rose, so did their lack of restraint. They had tried to maintain a veneer of civility at first, but now that mask had been stripped away, revealing their true nature, loud, crude, and aggressive. They spoke loudly, gestured wildly, and their every movement screamed of a self-importance that put them at the center of the universe. They were kings in their own little kingdom, and everyone else was either a subject or a jester. My daughter, Amy, moved around them like a nervous moth drawn to a dangerous flame. She refilled their glasses, cleared their used plates, and laughed at their crude jokes. Amy's laugh was too bright, too strained, like the sound of a violin string pulled taut to the breaking point. It was the laugh of a child afraid of being punished, trying desperately to prove how good she could be. Every time I heard it, my heart constricted. 10 years. And she was still trying to earn the approval of people who were incapable of loving anyone but themselves. I tried to make conversation with Patricia, but her replies were clipped, her eyes always darting away, constantly glancing towards her husband, as if waiting for an unspoken order. She was no longer a confidant, she was another warden in her own prison. So I just stayed silent, observing, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind blowing off the lake. It was Walter who started it. He drained his glass, slammed it down on the table with a sharp clack, and fixed his heavy gaze on Amy. She was standing by the railing, hugging herself for warmth. "Look at our little city, miss." Walter's voice boomed, full of mockery. Amy was wearing a thick turtleneck sweater and jeans. A perfectly sensible outfit for an October afternoon in the high country. "Afraid of a little lake breeze, you delicate thing?" Amy turned, trying to muster a graceful smile. "It's just a little windy, Dad." She called him Dad, a word that sounded so alien and painful coming from her lips. Julian chimed in immediately, his voice always dripping with sarcasm. "Wind? Back in my father's day, girls went swimming in October. They were hardy, tough." He puffed out his chest, as if comparing his generation's masculinity to his wife's fragility. A real greenhouse generation, weak. A tense silence fell. This was no longer just idle banter. It felt like an interrogation, a targeted attack. I could feel the danger coiling in their words, like the feeling you get when you spot a snake sliding through the grass. I couldn't sit by any longer. "Leave her be," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and firm enough to cut through the silence. "It is cold." Both father and son turned to look at me. Julian shot me a look of pure annoyance. He hated it when I intervened. In his eyes, I was just a bothersome mother-in-law, an old woman who worried too much about her daughter who would never grow up. "Oh, Martha," he said, drawing out my name mockingly. "Don't you worry so much. We're just having a bit of fun, aren't we, honey?" He winked at Amy. Amy, trapped in the middle, could only nod miserably. "Yes, Mom, it's nothing. Everything is fine." But everything was not fine. I saw it. A look. It passed between them in a split second, an electric current between Walter and Julian. It wasn't an ordinary look. It was the look of predators zeroing in on their prey. A shared understanding, a conspiracy hatched in their drunken, cruel minds. It was the way wolves look at a lamb before they attack, and in that instant, I knew this joke was about to get much, much worse. Walter stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden deck. His massive frame cast a long shadow across the entire porch. "All right then," he declared, his voice full of decision. "Let's see how tough she really is. Julian, give me a hand. What are you planning to do?" I shot to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. "Walter, stop it. This isn't funny." But they couldn't hear me anymore. They were like two animals that had caught the scent of blood. They moved in, grabbing Amy by both arms. She let out a startled cry, at first more out of surprise than fear. She still held onto a fragile sliver of hope that this was just a rough joke. "Dad, Julian, don't. Let me go," she said, trying to struggle, but her laughter was nervous and forced. She didn't want to spoil the fun, didn't want to be seen as a party pooper. That was always Amy's tragedy. She was willing to endure humiliation just to maintain the illusion of peace. They began to drag her across the perfect lawn toward the wooden pier that stretched out over the lake. I scrambled after them, the heels of my shoes sinking into the damp turf. "Stop it, right now. You're drunk. You don't know what you're doing." They ignored me completely. To them, I was just air, the annoying buzz of a mosquito. They dragged Amy, who was now beginning to panic for real, to the very end of the pier. From here, the water of Lake Tahoe looked terrifying. It was no longer the turquoise blue of daytime, but an inky black, bottomless, cold, and indifferent. Small waves lapped against the wooden pilings of the pier with a steady, gruesome rhythm. "Come on, city miss," Julian snarled, his hand gripping Amy's arm. "Show us how tough you are." "No, please don't." Amy's laughter was completely gone, replaced by a scream of pure panic. She finally understood. This wasn't a joke. This was cruelty, naked and undisguised. Her voice was filled with a genuine terror, the terror of someone facing a real, mortal threat. I lunged forward, trying to pull Julian off my daughter. I clawed at the sleeve of his jacket, using all the strength a 72-year-old woman could muster, but he just flung his arm out. A single, contemptuous, effortless gesture. I was shoved hard to the side, staggering and nearly falling onto the wooden planks. And in that brief moment while I was off balance, I saw it. With one last, savage laugh, a laugh that will haunt me for the rest of my days, they shoved her hard. Splash! There was no more screaming. Just the dull, heavy sound as my daughter's body, in her waterlogged autumn clothes, hit the frozen surface of the lake. She vanished instantly. All that was left were the dark, spreading ripples and a few bubbles that rose and broke the surface. Silence. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. A terrible, screaming silence that was louder in my ears than any scream could ever be. And then they laughed. A deep, hearty laugh, a booming sound, as if they had just witnessed the most brilliant piece of comedy. "That'll sober her up," Walter said, even wiping a tear of laughter from the corner of his eye. But Amy didn't surface. I stood frozen, my eyes glued to the black water where my daughter had disappeared. A scream was trapped in my throat, a silent scream of absolute terror. And then she surfaced, just for a moment. I saw her face, pale and twisted under the water. A thin, dark trickle of blood ran from her temple, looking almost black against her soaked skin. Her eyes were wide open, but they were empty, soulless. She didn't scream, she didn't thrash, she just stared into nothing. Then, her body went limp again, and she began to slowly sink once more. That's when the scream inside me finally broke free. It wasn't a human sound, it was an animalistic shriek, a gut-wrenching cry torn from the very depths of my soul. "Help! She's drowning! She hit her head on the rocks!" Walter and Julian, the two perpetrators, stood on the shore, motionless. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Martha." Julian waved a dismissive hand, as if shooing away a fly. "Don't be so dramatic. She knows how to swim." "Knock off the hysterics," Walter added, and he turned, casually walking toward his black SUV. "She'll climb out on her own. A little cold water never hurt anyone." They turned their backs and walked away. I stared at them, unable to believe my eyes. They were actually going to leave her there, in the freezing water. I screamed again, my voice cracking with desperation and rage. "Where are you going? Come back! She's dying!" A car door slammed shut. The engine roared to life. Julian stuck his head out the window, that same smug grin on his face, and yelled, "Don't ruin our evening, mother-in-law. See you at home." The SUV sped off. The crunch of gravel under the tires, the fading sound of the engine, and then silence. A silence broken only by the lapping of waves against the shore, and my own desperate screams dying in the cold evening air over the dark, indifferent lake. On that pier, that day, it wasn't just my daughter who nearly died. A part of me, the gentle, patient part, the part that always believed in some fragile goodness in people, sank to the bottom of the lake with her. And what surfaced in its place was something colder, harder, and much, much more dangerous. My screams faded into the air, leaving a chilling void. I stood there on the shore, trembling, not from the cold, but from something more primal. My throat was raw. My world had shrunk to the surface of that black water, and the fading ripples that were erasing the last trace of my daughter's existence. The sheer panic that had just ripped me apart suddenly condensed, freezing into a solid, heavy block of ice. It sank to the bottom of my soul, and in its place was a strange emptiness, an eerie calm. In that silence, I heard a sound, a faint, distant thump, 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 the sound of a small boat motor. I slowly turned my head. Beyond the reeds, about 100 yards from shore, a small inflatable boat was moving slowly. In it, a man in a faded camouflage jacket was fishing. A fisherman. I didn't scream again. I had no voice left. I simply raised my hand, a stiff, rigid arm, and pointed toward the spot on the lake where Amy had gone under. A simple gesture, but it held all of my horror and desperation. The man in the boat didn't understand at first. He squinted at me, but then he must have seen something in my face. My stillness, my rigid gesture, told him more than any scream ever could. He turned the tiller sharply. The engine roared, and the boat shot toward the pier, leaving a white wake behind it. A minute later, he was there. "What's wrong?" he yelled, his weathered face etched with seriousness. I couldn't answer. I could only point down into the water again. "Down, there," I managed to force out a hoarse whisper. He didn't ask another question. He cut the engine, grabbed a long pole with a hook on the end, and began probing the dark water. I stood there, motionless as a statue, watching him work. His every movement was precise, deliberate. He knew this lake. He knew what to do. And I, a woman who had lived 72 years, read thousands of books, and taught hundreds of students, was utterly helpless in that moment. Then, the hook caught on something. I saw a faint patch of light-colored fabric under the water, Amy's sweater. He leaned far over the side of the boat, nearly falling in, and with a grunt of immense effort, he hauled her up. When he pulled Amy into the boat, I saw her face. It was blue, lifeless. It was then that the block of ice inside me shattered, but it didn't melt into water. It broke into 1,000 sharp shards that embedded themselves in every fiber of my soul. I pulled out my cell phone. My fingers were trembling, not from fear anymore, but from a rising cold fury. I forced them to obey, dialing 911. 911. "What's your emergency?" My voice, when it came out, was so calm and clear it startled me. I gave the address of the lodge, directing them to the lakeshore. I didn't cry. My voice was foreign, machine-like. While the fisherman performed CPR on my daughter in the boat, I stood on the shore, guiding the paramedics over the phone. Images flashed through my mind like a high-speed film. Amy, 5 years old, sobbing in my arms over a skinned knee. Amy, first grade, with 2 pigtails tied with huge white ribbons, proudly bringing her first bouquet of flowers to her teacher. Amy, at her high school graduation, twirling in a simple but beautiful prom dress, her eyes shining with joy and hope. And Amy, on her wedding day, looking at Julian with a trust and hope so vast that I had wanted to scream, "Don't do it, my love. They will destroy you." But I had stayed silent. I had stayed silent then, and I had stayed silent for 10 long years, for the sake of the fragile, hard-won happiness she was trying to build. I had smiled at those people, shaken their hands, sat at their table, and swallowed their poisonous words like bitter medicine. I thought it was my sacrifice, a sacrifice for my daughter's family. How foolish I had been. The ambulance arrived quickly, 2 paramedics rushed out with a stretcher. They swarmed over Amy, connecting her to monitors, covering her with a silver thermal blanket. I caught fragments of their dialogue. Weak pulse, severe hypothermia, head trauma. They worked in perfect, swift coordination, like a single machine. The fisherman stood nearby, twisting his cap in his hands. He started to say something, but I just looked at him and nodded. A nod of thanks, and also a nod of dismissal. He understood. He quietly turned and went back to his boat. I stood there, watching the flashing lights of the ambulance reflect on the still surface of the lake, and in that moment, I knew that my old life was over. The life where I was just a mother-in-law, a quiet, overlooked retired school teacher. That woman was dead. She had died on that pier, the moment her daughter slipped beneath the waves to the sound of her own husband's laughter. I pulled out my phone again. This time, my fingers weren't shaking from shock. They were shaking with something else. A pure, cold rage. A decision had been made. I scrolled through my contacts, names, numbers, and then I stopped on one. A single name, Samuel, my brother. I hadn't called this number in over 10 years, not because we hated each other, but because our paths had diverged so completely. The last time we had really talked was after he was forced into early retirement. Samuel had been the best federal auditor in the business, a bloodhound the Department of Justice would unleash to sniff out the most sophisticated financial crimes. But he was too good, too uncompromising. He uncovered a massive corruption scandal that went all the way up to a powerful senator, and instead of being rewarded, he was sidelined, isolated, until he finally took the hint and left. We'd had a huge fight about it then. I couldn't accept his methods, his ruthlessness, his obsession with exposing the truth at any cost. And now, that very ruthlessness, that very obsession, was the only thing I needed. I pressed the call button. Samuel's office was no longer a space filled with numbers and financial reports. After retiring, he had gone back to school, and now he was a psychotherapist. An ironic twist, moving from analyzing fraudulent numbers to analyzing broken souls. His office was cozy, with soft leather armchairs, gentle abstract paintings on the walls, and shelves full of psychology books. He was sitting in his chair, wearing reading glasses, looking over a patient's file. A 74-year-old man with a full head of white hair, but the eyes behind the glasses were still as sharp as a scalpel. His phone rang. An unknown number. He usually didn't answer unknown numbers, but some instinct made him pick it up. "Hello? Samuel, it's me." My voice was a hoarse whisper. I didn't want the paramedics who were getting Amy ready to move to hear me. This was not their conversation. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could almost feel him sitting up straighter, the gears in his brilliant mind beginning to turn. He didn't ask, "Are you okay?" or "What's wrong?" Samuel never wasted time on useless questions. "I'm listening, Martha," he finally said, his voice low and serious. I looked down the dirt road where the Crofts' SUV had disappeared 15 minutes earlier. By now, they were probably almost back to the city, music playing, laughing, looking forward to a cozy evening by the fire. They had no idea that their cozy world had just begun to fracture. "They're on their way home," I whispered into the phone, each word a sharp piece of ice. "Do what you do best." I didn't wait for him to reply. I hung up. The decision was made. All the bridges were burned. The old rules no longer applied. The back doors of the ambulance slammed shut. The siren wailed, tearing through the descending night, and the vehicle sped away, carrying my daughter and what was left of our old life. I didn't leave the hospital. I spent the entire night in a hard plastic chair, the only softness coming from a jacket a kind nurse had draped over my shoulders. This hallway, at night, was its own world. It was so sterile the air smelled of chemicals, lit by fluorescent bulbs that cast a pale, sickly green light. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy, weighted silence, broken every so often by the hurried rush of gurney wheels, the steady beep of some machine from behind a closed door, or the hushed whispers of doctors and nurses changing shifts. Every sound was a reminder of the fragility of life, of the battle being waged just beyond the white door I was staring at. I didn't sleep. I didn't cry either. The tears seemed to have frozen solid with my heart back at the lake. Instead, I sat there, wide awake, and I thought, for the first time in years, my mind was terrifyingly sharp and clear. I didn't think about what-ifs. I didn't torture myself with regret. Grief had given way to something else, a cold, clear purpose. I had given Samuel the bomb. Now, my job was to gather the detonators. Dawn didn't arrive with a warm, golden glow, but with a shift in the hospital's rhythm. The footsteps became more urgent, the voices louder. A young doctor, with dark circles under his eyes and a mess of tangled hair, stepped out of the ICU. He looked exhausted, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Mrs. Hayes?" I shot to my feet, my heart, for the first time in hours, giving a painful lurch. "Her condition has stabilized," he said, and I let out a breath I didn't even know I'd been holding. "It's serious, but stable. Concussion, severe hypothermia, water in her lungs, but your daughter is a fighter. She's going to live. She's going to live." Those 4 words didn't bring the relief I expected. They didn't melt the block of ice in my chest. Instead, they hardened it. They gave me certainty, the certainty that I was doing the right thing. Amy's survival wasn't a pardon for the Crofts. It was their sentence. They let me see her for 5 minutes. The room was filled with the beeping and whirring of machines, each sound a beat in an artificial pulse of life. My Amy lay there, so small and pale in the oversized hospital bed. A bandage was wrapped around her head, and beneath it, a dark red bloodstain had seeped through. Wires and tubes crisscrossed her body, making her seem like just another part of the machinery. I looked at her, the child I had brought into this world, and I felt nothing but a cold weight, an ironclad resolve. My love for her hadn't vanished. It had simply stepped aside, making way for a much older, more terrifying instinct, the instinct to protect one's young at any cost. I gently took her cold hand in mine and whispered, "I'm here, my love. Everything is going to be okay, I promise." That promise wasn't for her, it was for me. When I returned to the hallway, a surprise was waiting for me. A nurse called out, "Mrs. Hayes, there's a delivery for you." She pointed toward a small table in the corner of the waiting area, and there, standing like a ghostly apparition, was a gigantic floral arrangement. No, it wasn't an arrangement. It was a grotesque installation made entirely of white lilies. Hundreds of them, their waxy petals opened wide as a hand, revealing pollen-dusted stamens. Their scent, a cloying, sweet perfume, the smell of a funeral home, filled the entire corridor, overpowering the sterile scent of antiseptic. It was too ostentatious, too absurd, and completely out of place here. It was an invasion. And tucked among the blossoms was a crisp white envelope. I knew who it was from. My heart didn't beat faster. It just beat with a cold, steady rhythm. I walked over and pulled out the envelope. Inside was a card made of expensive, heavy stock, embossed with the logo of some high-end brand. And on it, written in Julian's flamboyant, conceited script, was a single sentence. "Darling, don't let your mother's drama spoil our fun." I read it. Then I read it again. Not a single muscle in my face moved. Drama. Fun. Those words, in this context, weren't just callous. They were a declaration of war. They weren't just unremorseful. They didn't even comprehend the gravity of what had happened. They still thought this was a game, a play I had directed. They still saw themselves as the center of the universe, where everyone else was just a supporting actor in their story. They had no idea I had torn up the old script and was writing an entirely new one. And in my play, the roles for them would be very, very different. I calmly folded the card, slipped it into my coat pocket with my phone. It was no longer an insult. It was Exhibit A. I turned to the nurse, who was watching me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. "Please," I said, my voice flat, devoid of any emotion. I gestured with my chin toward the flowers. "Get this out of here for me. My daughter is allergic." The nurse looked at me, then at the lavish arrangement, then back at me. Confusion and sympathy warred in her eyes. She probably thought I'd gone mad with grief. She nodded and called for an orderly. As they carried the suffocatingly white display away, the hallway seemed to breathe a little easier. I sat back down in my plastic chair, with a card in my pocket and a plan in my heart. I thought I would have to fight this war alone. I was prepared for that. But sometimes, history provides allies from the most unexpected of places. As evening fell and the hallway grew quiet, I saw a familiar figure hesitating at the far end of the corridor. A woman in a long beige coat, the hood pulled up, moving with the furtive air of a thief. But I recognized her instantly. Patricia Croft. She approached, her eyes darting around as if she were afraid of being caught. She looked even more haggard than she had at the gala. Her makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion and the deep-seated fear in her eyes. "Amy," she whispered, her voice trembling. How is she?" I looked directly at her, not with judgment, not with welcome. I simply stated the facts. She's going to live, but a part of her died in that lake, a part that your son and your husband killed. My blunt words seemed to strike a nerve. Her shoulders slumped. She didn't argue, didn't make excuses. Instead, she brought a hand to her mouth, and the tears she had been holding back for years began to stream down her cheeks. She wept silently, her body shaking with suppressed sobs. I know," she choked out. "I know what Walter is capable of. I know how cruel he can be." And then, she did something I could never have anticipated. She opened her large handbag and pulled something out. An old diary, bound in dark blue leather that was worn and faded with time. I can't be silent anymore," she said, her voice breaking between sobs. "He's ruined my life. Don't let him ruin your daughter's." Her trembling hand flipped it open to a page marked with a small ribbon. The entry was written in faded ink from more than 20 years ago. "Patricia, what is this?" I asked, my voice softening just a fraction. "Just read," she pleaded. I took the diary. Patricia's handwriting was beautiful, elegant, but on this page it was a frantic, rushed scrawl, as if written in a state of extreme agitation. The date was from 22 years ago, about a week after the papers had reported the accidental death of an architect named Kenji Tanaka. I read, "Walter has had nightmares for a week since Kenji's accident. He screams in his sleep every night. He talks. I heard him. He said, he shouldn't have threatened me. He deserved it. And one night, he sat bolt upright, drenched in sweat, and he said, 'The deep lake will keep all secrets.' I asked him about it the next morning, and he slapped me. For the first time. He told me I misheard, and forbade me from ever speaking of it again." I looked up at Patricia, a cold dread washing over me. There it was. This wasn't a hunch, a suspicion. This was a testimony, a critical piece of the puzzle that Samuel would need. Patricia looked at me, her tear-filled eyes holding both fear and a fragile spark of determination. "This is all I have. For 22 years I've held on to it. I've been so scared. But when I heard what happened to Amy, I knew I couldn't be a coward any longer." She pushed the diary toward me. "Please, use it. Make him pay. For Kenji, for Amy, and for me." In that moment, I no longer saw Patricia Croft, the wife of my enemy. I saw another woman, another victim of the same tyrant. She had been living in a private hell for 40 years. And today, she had just handed me the key to unlock its doors, not just for herself, but for all of us. I reached out, not to take the diary, but to cover her cold, trembling hand with my own. "Thank you, Patricia," I said, and my voice was no longer cold, but filled with a genuine respect. "From now on, we're on the same side." She looked at me, a flicker of surprise in her tired eyes. It had probably been a very long time since anyone had told her they were on her side. She gave my hand a weak squeeze, but it was full of meaning. That night, long after Patricia had gone, I sat in the hospital corridor, clutching her diary like a sacred text. I wasn't alone anymore. I had an ally. An unexpected ally, one who had been living deep inside the enemy's camp, and I knew that with this weapon, the plan Samuel and I were forming wouldn't just be revenge, it would be a revolution. My kitchen had always been the heart of my home. It's small, but it's flooded with morning sun and the scent of dried herbs hanging from the window. It was where I baked thousands of cookies for Amy, where I spent hours grading my students' papers, and where I found peace after my husband passed. But in these past few days, my kitchen had become something else. It had become our war room. My old scanner, usually reserved for archiving family recipes, was now working overtime. Page by page, Patricia's diary was carefully digitized, her frantic words appearing stark and clear on my laptop screen. Each word was a bullet. The entire diary was an arsenal. Amy had been moved to a private rehabilitation facility, a quieter, safer place. She was still weak, but her memory was slowly returning, bringing with it the pain and disillusionment. We didn't talk much about what happened at the lake. Not yet. Right now, she needed to heal. And the best way I could help her heal was to ensure the people who hurt her would never have the chance to hurt anyone again. I was on a video call with Samuel. His face filled the screen, looking serious and focused. Behind him were bookshelves filled with the works of Freud, Jung, and Adler. He was applying everything he had learned about the human mind to this fight. "You've done very well, Martha," he said after I sent him the last of the scanned files. His voice was low and steady, a strange comfort. "This diary isn't just evidence, it's the key to unlocking their psychology." He shared his screen. On it were 2 psychological profiles he had drafted, just like he used to analyze the financial statements of fraudulent corporations. "Walter," he began, the cursor hovering over the name. "Everything about him revolves around control. He controls his business, his family, his public image. The greatest fear for a man like that is losing control. We won't attack him head-on. We're going to make him feel as if the ground is slowly crumbling beneath his feet, without him knowing why or how to stop it." He switched to the second profile. "Julian. By contrast, Julian is not a controller. He's a dependent. He's dependent on his father's money and power. His primary motivators are greed and cowardice. His fatal flaw is his terror of being abandoned, of being deemed useless and cast aside by his father. We will aim directly at that fear." The plan began to take shape, not with swords and shields, but with psychological poison darts, aimed with precision at their most vulnerable points. "Can you get Patricia to help?" Samuel asked. "We need someone on the inside." I thought of Patricia, of the pleading look in her eyes at the hospital. "I think so. She's suffered enough. She's ready." "Good," Samuel nodded. "Then let's begin to plant the first seeds." Julian's office was on the top floor of a skyscraper in downtown Denver. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls looked out over the entire city and the majestic Rocky Mountains beyond. Everything in the room, from the polished ebony desk to the expensive contemporary art on the wall, screamed one message: "I am successful, I am powerful." Julian was sitting in his leather chair, his feet propped up on his desk, laughing on the phone with a broker about some lucrative deal. He looked completely at ease, as if the incident at Lake Tahoe was nothing more than a fleeting, unpleasant memory, a bad hangover now forgotten. He believed the matter was settled. Amy was in some expensive facility, and his troublesome mother-in-law had finally fallen silent. Then, an email notification popped up on his computer screen. It was from an encrypted, nonsensical address. The subject line contained a single word: Tahoe. Julian's heart skipped a beat. He ended the call abruptly and clicked open the email. The message inside was short, with no greeting and no direct threat. It was simply a question and a suggestion. "Julian, is Walter preparing for a surprise retirement? You should check the trust funds in the Cayman Islands. He made a very large transfer right after the Tahoe trip. A friend." The color drained from Julian's face. The smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of confusion and suspicion. The Cayman Islands. That's where Walter kept his real nest egg, funds that even Julian only knew about vaguely. After the Tahoe trip. The timing was too specific. A friend. Who? Who could possibly know about this? The seed of doubt was sown. Julian immediately forgot about the lucrative deal. He began to frantically log into the international bank accounts he had access to, comparing numbers, searching for any sign of betrayal. The mouse in his hand began to tremble. Walter's study was his sanctuary. It was paneled in dark oak, filled with Chesterfield leather chairs, and dominated by a desk the size of an aircraft carrier. The walls were covered with framed photos of him, with politicians, tycoons, other powerful men. This was where he ruled his empire. Walter was reviewing the blueprints for a new shopping mall project. He was completely focused, his scowl capable of making the most seasoned architects tremble. Patricia entered, as quiet as a shadow. She placed a blue leather portfolio on his desk, her expression as submissive and impassive as always. "The documents for tomorrow's city council meeting, dear," she said, her voice a monotone. "Just leave it," Walter grunted, not looking up. Patricia left without another word. A little while later, after he had finished with the blueprints, Walter flipped open the portfolio. He was looking for a financial report, but tucked just behind the cover page was something else. A single printed sheet of A4 paper. It was a copy of an old article, pulled from the archives of the Denver Post, the date yellowed with age. The headline was in bold print, 22 years since the disappearance of architect Kenji Tanaka, a mystery unanswered. Walter froze. He stared at the article, then looked up and around the room as if searching for a ghost. This safe room, his impenetrable fortress, suddenly felt violated. Who put this here? Patricia? Impossible. She didn't have the nerve. A maid? Even less likely. Who then? The seed of paranoia was sown. Walter felt a chill run down his spine. The past that he had buried so carefully, so deep, was showing signs of wanting to claw its way back to the surface. He hurriedly crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash, but the image of Kenji Tanaka's face from the article, his optimistic smile, haunted him. I was sitting in my living room, the only light coming from a single reading lamp. I wasn't reading. I was staring at my phone. I had sent a text message from a burner phone Samuel had given me, a message for Walter. Its content was just as brief as the email to Julian. The deep lake will keep all secrets. Are you sure about that, Walter? I didn't expect him to reply. I just wanted him to read it. I wanted those words, the very words Patricia had overheard in his nightmare 22 years ago, to echo in his mind, to stir the demons he had tried so hard to keep locked away. The war had truly begun. We weren't using bombs and bullets. We were using their own secrets and fears as our weapons. We were turning their fortress into a psychological prison, and the Crofts, father and son, the jailers, were slowly becoming the most terrified inmates, suspicious of their own shadows and of each other. The mind games had only just begun. Leo Tanaka's office was the polar opposite of Julian's. It didn't showcase wealth, it showcased intellect. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, groaning under the weight of thick legal volumes and neatly bound case files. The air smelled of old paper, black coffee, and intense focus. It exuded an aura of order, discipline, and an unshakable resolve. Samuel and I sat across from Leo Tanaka. He was a man in his 40s, of Asian descent, with a trim physique and a perfectly tailored suit. But the impression he made didn't come from his appearance. It came from his eyes. They were dark, deep, and as sharp as an obsidian blade. They were the eyes of a man who had lived with an unanswered question for far too long, the eyes of a man who had turned grief into fuel. Samuel had arranged the meeting. He'd found Leo without much trouble. After the death of his father, Kenji Tanaka, the family had left Denver, trying to escape the painful memories. But Leo, after graduating from a top law school, had returned. He didn't say it out loud, but Samuel and I both understood. He came back for answers. He had opened a law firm specializing in corporate malfeasance, as if he were preparing for a battle he knew would one day come. Samuel didn't beat around the bush. He placed a copy of the pages from Patricia's diary on the polished oak desk between us. "Mr. Tanaka," Samuel began, his voice calm and respectful, "we believe your father's death was not an accident." Leo showed no surprise. He was silent, just leaning forward to read the faded script, his hands resting on the desk, slowly clenched into fists. The silence in the room grew heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. I could see his jaw tighten as he read the words Walter had spoken in his nightmares. "He shouldn't have threatened me. The deep lake will keep all secrets." When he finished, he looked up, and for the first time, I saw something other than sharpness in his eyes. I saw the pain of an 18-year-old boy who had lost his father suddenly and unjustly. "I knew it," he said, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion. "In my gut, I always knew. My father was an excellent swimmer. He was obsessively careful on his boat. The story that he got drunk, slipped, and hit his head on the propeller, it never made sense." He paused, taking a deep breath to regain his professional composure. "But I had nothing, just a son's instinct. The police closed the case so quickly. Evidence conveniently disappeared. I tried to reopen it 10 years ago, but they said the statute of limitations had passed for an accident. There was no proof of foul play." Samuel nodded with understanding. "There is now," he said, gesturing to the papers on the desk. "This is a witness statement, however indirect, and we have a new reason for them to pay attention." I spoke up, my voice still frail from the stressful days, but clear. "They tried to do the same thing to my daughter, on that same lake." Leo's gaze shifted to me. The lawyer's acuity now mingled with the empathy of a fellow victim. He saw the connection, the horrible, overarching pattern. Walter Croft hadn't just killed once. It was a behavioral model. He used violence to silence those who stood in his way. "Now," Samuel continued, "we have a fresh assault, with a witness, that can be directly linked to a questionable old case. We can create legal pressure they cannot ignore." Leo Tanaka leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together. His legal mind was working at full speed. He was no longer just a grieving son, he was a warrior. "We have to do this intelligently," he said, his voice having regained its sharp edge completely. "If we go straight to the police with an old diary, Walter will use his lawyers to discredit it, call it the words of a disgruntled wife. We need to attack on multiple fronts, build public pressure while simultaneously using the official legal channels." He stood and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling Denver streets. "Walter Croft has built an image of invincibility. He's a philanthropist, a pillar of the community. Before we can attack the man, we have to destroy the mask." He turned back to us, a cold fire in his eyes. "Let me handle the legal side. I'll draft an official letter, requesting the district attorney's office reopen the investigation based on the suspicious connections between the two incidents. It will force their hand." Then he looked at Samuel. "As for the court of public opinion, I imagine you, with your background, know exactly what to do." The meeting ended with a handshake, not a polite formality, but a silent oath. An alliance was forged, built not on hatred, but on a shared thirst for justice. The three of us, from three different worlds, a retired history teacher, a former auditor turned therapist, and a lawyer haunted by his past, had aimed our spears at the same monster. The following days were not spent in passive waiting. No, they were a silent symphony, each note a calculated action, each rest a held breath of anticipation. Our war wasn't fought on a noisy battlefield, but in quiet offices, dimly lit coffee shops, and sterile hospital rooms. It was a series of quiet but powerful actions, like the way unseen currents erode the foundations of a seemingly impenetrable fortress. I could almost hear the steady hum of the printer in Leo Tanaka's pristine office, a mechanical, soulless sound creating a powerful weapon. I pictured the heavy, elegant paper with Tanaka and Associates formally embossed at the top, sliding slowly from the machine. It wasn't just a letter, it was the first legal spearhead, sharpened by 22 years of grief and the cold precision of the law. I had read the draft Leo sent us. Every word was weighed, devoid of emotion, filled only with facts and razor-sharp questions. And then, near the end, the decisive paragraph, the heart of the attack, "We formally request that the district attorney's office reopen the investigation into the death of Mr. Kenji Tanaka, which occurred on August 15th, 22 years prior, based on new evidence and the alarming similarities to the recent assault on Mrs. Amelia Croft." The door to justice, which had been bolted and collecting dust for 2 decades, wasn't opened with a bang, but with a mundane act. I imagined a mail carrier in a blue uniform, perhaps yawning from a lack of sleep, trudging up to the Denver DA's building. He would sort through hundreds of letters, and then he would slide Leo's envelope into the narrow slot of a metal mailbox, a soft clink as it hit the bottom. A tiny sound, meaningless to passers-by, but to us, it was the loudest knock on a door that had been delayed for 22 years. At the same time, on another front, Samuel was playing his part. He didn't choose a law office or a government building. His battlefield was a small coffee shop tucked away in an alley, a dim place with the smell of dark roast and the sound of soft jazz, where important conversations could happen unnoticed. I knew the place. Samuel used to call it his confessional. He sat across from a middle-aged man, an investigative journalist Samuel knew from his days at the DOJ. I'd met him once, an old wolf of the press, weary from sleepless nights and endless fights with power, but whose eyes were still sharp and hungry for a story. Samuel didn't place Patricia's diary on the table. That would be too obvious, too dangerous. Instead, he stirred his coffee slowly and began to tell a story. "I have a hypothetical for you," Samuel began, his voice low and even, like a storyteller by a fire. "Imagine there's a powerful real estate tycoon in this city, well respected, a pillar of the community." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. "And 22 years ago, his business partner, a brilliant architect, suddenly disappears in a suspicious fishing accident. The case is closed in a hurry." The journalist took no notes. He just listened, his eyes never leaving Samuel's. "Then recently," Samuel continued, "on that very same lake, this tycoon's family is involved in another incident, a practical joke that nearly kills another family member. A strange coincidence, don't you think?" He leaned back, looking his companion straight in the eye. He wasn't offering proof, he was offering questions, disconnected puzzle pieces that a sharp mind could put together on its own. "Imagine," Samuel concluded, his voice now almost a whisper, "if there were a connection between two events, 22 years apart, in the same location, involving the same man. That would be quite a story to tell, wouldn't it?" The journalist was silent for a long moment. He looked out the window at the people hurrying by. Then he looked back at Samuel. He didn't say, "I'll look into it." He just gave a single, decisive nod. His tired eyes were now lit up, not with loud excitement, but with the intense focus of a predator who has just caught the scent of big game. The seed had been planted in the fertile ground of professional skepticism. And while those wheels were turning, I was with my daughter, in the rehabilitation room, where the afternoon sun cast long stripes of light across the floor. Amy was sitting up in bed, propped against pillows, a sketchbook in her lap. She was drawing, her fingers moving a charcoal pencil slowly but surely. Her hand still had a slight tremor, a lingering effect of the nerve damage, but her lines were beginning to find their old confidence, a life that had been long lost. I sat in the chair beside her bed, just watching her quietly. I didn't want to disturb her creative flow, but then she stopped abruptly, her eyes still on the page. "You and Uncle Samuel, you're doing something, aren't you?" Her voice was very soft, not an accusation, but a quiet acknowledgement. I reached out and placed my hand over hers, the one holding the pencil. Her skin was still cool to the touch. "I'm correcting a mistake in history, my love," I said gently, meeting her eyes as she looked up. "My own mistake of being silent for too long, and the terrible mistakes of others." A deep understanding dawned in Amy's eyes. For the first time in days, the fear and confusion were replaced by a different light, a spark of resolve, of awareness. She didn't ask any more questions. She didn't ask what the plan was, or what we were going to do. She just gave my hand a gentle squeeze of confirmation and then went back to her sketch. She knew she was no longer alone in this fight. She was a part of it, and her healing was our greatest motivation. The fortress of the Croft family, built on money, power, and silence, was now under assault from all sides. A legal spear was drilling into its foundations. An underground tide of public opinion was slowly eroding its facade of false morality. And from within, the termites of suspicion and paranoia that we had planted were eating away at the very structure of their family's power. The storm was gathering, and this time, no fortress would be strong enough to shelter them. That night, Walter's study was no longer a sanctuary of power. It had become a cage. He paced back and forth across the expensive Persian rug, his steps heavy and frantic like a trapped animal's. The only light in the room came from the green-shaded desk lamp, which cast his face in shadow, making the lines seem deeper, and his eyes burn with a feral fire of rage and panic. On the massive ebony desk, in a state of disarray that never belonged there, were a half-empty glass of whiskey, an ashtray overflowing with crushed cigars, and at the center, like an indictment, was the official letter from Leo Tanaka's law firm. The words were crisply and formally printed, but to Walter, they were like snakes slithering off the page to wrap around his throat. The storm we had created was hitting from every direction. Leo's letter had forced the district attorney's office to review the old file, a polite term for launching an unofficial inquiry. The hypothetical story Samuel had fed his journalist friend had been published on an influential political blog. It didn't name Walter, but the details about a Denver real estate magnate and a mysterious disappearance on the lake, were clear enough that people in their circle had started to whisper. The calls Walter made to his powerful connections were no longer answered with enthusiasm, but with a cool caution. The ship was showing signs of sinking, and the smart rats were already looking for a way off. But the most devastating blow came from within. The study door flew open without a knock. Julian stormed in, his face pale, not with fear but with a manic fury. His hair was a mess, and in his hand was his smartphone, the screen glowing with the anonymous email we had sent. "Were you going to cut me out?" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with outrage. He slammed the phone down on the desk next to Leo's letter. "Moving money offshore? Planning to abandon me and save yourself? Do you think I'm an idiot?" Walter stopped pacing and turned to face his son. For a second, I thought he would strike him, but instead a tired, contemptuous smile played on his lips. "You are an idiot," Walter snarled, his voice raw. "Don't you see what's happening? It's all falling apart, and it's because of you. Your stupid little prank at the lake is what started all of this. You woke a demon that should have stayed asleep. Now Tanaka's kid is digging everything up." He snatched Leo's letter, crumpling it in his fist. "Do you understand? This isn't about some nagging wife or an annoying mother-in-law anymore. This is about 22 years ago. This is about murder." Julian froze. He'd known about the Tanaka business, but only in whispers, in half-told stories. He'd never heard his father admit it so bluntly. Fear began to cut through his anger. He realized the stakes were much higher than he had ever imagined. And in a moment of cunning, an act of self-preservation as instinctive as a cornered animal's, Julian did something that would change everything. He pulled his own phone from his pocket, pretending to look at the email again, but his thumb secretly swiped across the screen, opened the voice memo app, and pressed the red record button. He placed the phone face down on the desk, next to the other one, amidst the clutter. A small, discreet action, a betrayal hidden in the chaos. "I was only following your lead," Julian yelled, deliberately provocative, trying to draw his father deeper into the trap he'd just set. "I learned everything from you. You handled Tanaka. Why couldn't we handle some old woman and a weak-willed wife?" The bait was cast, and Walter, in his rage and utter panic, took it. He lunged forward and grabbed Julian by the collar. His face was inches from his son's, his eyes bloodshot like a wounded bull's. "You do not compare," Walter roared, spittle flying from his mouth. "You don't understand anything. I did what I had to do, because Tanaka was going to expose me. He had proof I cut corners on that project. He dared to demand what wasn't his. I taught him a lesson at that damn lake." He shoved Julian away. Julian stumbled backward, falling into a leather chair. Walter stood panting, leaning on the desk, the rage having drained him of his strength. "And you?" he said, his voice now a contemptuous whisper. "You just made a mess because of your own stupidity and arrogance. You don't solve problems. You are the problem. You are a disgrace." Silence filled the room. The confession had been made, clear, complete, and undeniable. It now sat, safely recorded in the memory of a smartphone, waiting to be played for the world to hear. Julian sat motionless in the chair, his face ashen. His father's final words hurt more than a slap. He had been cast aside. He had been called a disgrace. And in that moment, any loyalty, any fear he had for his father evaporated, leaving only one desire: survival. The interrogation room was small, stuffy, and windowless. The walls were a dingy gray, the table was cold metal, and the two chairs were hard. It was a place where empires fall and truths are laid bare. Julian sat in one of the chairs, across from two detectives. One was older, weary, but experienced. The other was younger, with sharp eyes. Julian no longer had his usual polished look. He was wearing yesterday's wrinkled clothes and had dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept. "I have something," Julian said, his voice barely audible. He pushed his phone across the table. "I want a deal." The older detective looked at him, then at the phone. He didn't rush. He had seen too many men like Julian, men willing to sell out their own family to save themselves. "A deal?" he asked, his voice flat. "You're under investigation for the assault of your wife, Mr. Croft. What do you think you have to bargain with?" "This," Julian insisted, pointing at the phone, This is much bigger than that. This is about 22 years ago. This is about Kenji Tanaka." The two detectives exchanged a look. That name had started coming up in their briefings again. The younger detective picked up the phone. He pressed play. And then, Walter Croft's guttural roar filled the small, suffocating room. "I taught him a lesson at that damn lake." Silence descended after the recording ended. The detectives said nothing. They didn't have to. It was all there. They had it. The confession. The thing they hadn't been able to get for 22 years. I wasn't there to witness it. I didn't want to be. My satisfaction didn't come from seeing my enemies fall, but from knowing my daughter would be safe. But Samuel, in our later talks, pieced it together for me, and a history teacher's imagination painted the rest of the picture in vivid detail. I can see it, as clearly as if I were watching an old film. It began on a bright, clear Tuesday morning, an offensively normal morning in the wealthy Cherry Creek neighborhood. The automatic sprinklers were still glinting on the manicured lawns. Gardeners were silently trimming perfect hedges. A false, moneyed peace hung over the massive, silent homes. And then, that peace was broken, not by a loud noise, but by a threatening presence. A convoy of unmarked cars, 3 nondescript black sedans, turned quietly into the neighborhood. They moved in sync, without haste, like steel sharks gliding silently toward their prey. They stopped before the huge, ornate, wrought-iron gates of the Croft estate, a symbol of the power and separation Walter had built to protect himself from the outside world. But today, those gates could not protect him. Inside that fortress, Walter Croft was sitting alone in the vast dining room. The long mahogany table, which could seat 20, looked cavernous and empty. Weak morning light streamed through the large window, illuminating a plate of mostly untouched food. The scrambled eggs were cold, the bacon congealed. Walter wasn't eating. He just sat there, in his silk pajamas, listlessly stirring his coffee. The silver spoon made a small, monotonous clink, clink, clink against the china in the immense silence of the house. Patricia was gone. She had left early that morning, leaving only a short note on his pillow. "I'm done." A quiet but definitive liberation. His partner, his silent accomplice of 40 years, had left him. The ship was sinking, and the first mate had taken a lifeboat. The doorbell rang, a sharp, piercing sound that tore through the heavy silence. Walter flinched, the spoon clattering against his saucer. He frowned in annoyance. Who would dare disturb him at this hour? A maid, a new, young girl, opened the door hesitantly, and then they came in. 6 men in plain clothes, their suits ill-fitting, their faces impassive. They flooded into his marble foyer, bringing with them the cold, sterile air of a government agency. The man in the lead was the older detective, the one who had sat across from Julian in the interrogation room the day before. He wasted no time. He walked straight into the dining room while the others fanned out, securing the exits. The detective stopped at the dining table and looked directly at Walter. "Walter Croft?" he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, not of hatred or of triumph. "Just business. You're under arrest on suspicion of your involvement in the death of Kenji Tanaka." Walter looked up, the coffee cup still in his hand. His face, for a single moment, was a portrait of pure, unadulterated shock. It wasn't the fear of a criminal caught in the act. It was the disbelief, the utter bewilderment of a god being overthrown by his own worshippers. It was like a king being arrested in his own palace by his own personal guard. The rules had been broken. His world, the universe of which he was the center, had been violently thrown off its axis. His eyes scanned the room, then darted to the hallway. He was looking for Julian. He was looking for Patricia. He was looking for someone to blame, someone to rage at, but there was no one. The son he despised had betrayed him. The wife he dismissed had abandoned him. In the final, climactic moment of his downfall, he was utterly and completely alone. When they moved in to handcuff him, he didn't resist. He just sat there, motionless. I can imagine the feeling of the cold metal closing around his wrists, those hands. The hands that had signed million-dollar contracts, that had clapped powerful backs, that had gripped Patricia's wrist, and that had pushed his daughter-in-law into an icy lake. Now, they were powerless in a pair of steel handcuffs. And in that moment, As the click of the cuffs echoed in the silent room, I believe he finally understood. His empire didn't collapse because of an outside enemy, not because of a clever lawyer or an old mother-in-law. It imploded from within. It was destroyed by his own arrogance, which made him believe he was above the law. It was destroyed by his own cruelty, which turned his wife into a silent witness and created a lifelong enemy from his victim's son. And most of all, it was destroyed by the cowardice of the son he had created in his own selfish image. 6 months can be a short time, or it can be a lifetime. 6 months ago, my daughter was lying in a hospital bed, a victim. Today, she is a survivor. And more than that, she is truly alive. Amy's new art studio isn't large, just a converted loft in an old arts district of Denver, with exposed brick walls and huge paned windows that look out over historic rooftops. But the space is flooded with light, both the natural light from outside and the light that radiates from her own work. After years of being forced to paint safe, soulless landscapes to hang in the cold houses of the Crofts, Amy had finally found her voice again. The canvases on the walls and easels were now bursting with color, with emotion. There were intense paintings, with dark swirling masses of color like a furious storm, recreating the terror she had endured. But there were other paintings too, gentler ones, with bright pastel hues, depicting wildflowers pushing through cracks in the concrete, of morning sun streaming through a window. It was the journey of her healing, told with brush and pigment. I walked in, carrying a basket of apples and a freshly baked pie. The smell of oil paint and turpentine mingled with cinnamon and apple to create a wonderfully comforting aroma. Amy was standing with her back to me, in front of a large canvas. She was wearing an old, paint-splattered shirt, her hair piled messily on top of her head. She looked beautiful, a real, unadorned beauty. The painting she was working on was a landscape of a lake, but it wasn't the terrifying Lake Tahoe. The water in the painting was still, reflecting a brilliant sunset sky of orange and purple. It was peaceful. It was forgiveness, not for those who had hurt her, but for herself, allowing herself to find peace again. She heard my footsteps and turned, a gentle smile on her lips. A real smile, with no trace of strain, a smile that reached all the way to her now clear, tranquil eyes. "Mom," she said, "I think I'm going to call this one Stillness." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, setting the basket down on a small table. "It's beautiful, just like you." We didn't need to say much. Between us now was a deep understanding, forged through fire and water. We had walked through hell and back together, and our bond was stronger than ever. We had learned that family isn't always about blood, but about the people who stand with you in the darkest moments, the people who help you find the light again. A few weeks later, on an autumn afternoon when the sun was the color of honey, we had an appointment. The Denver Botanic Gardens were magnificent this time of year. The maples and oaks were turning, creating a brilliant tapestry of red, gold, and orange. The air was crisp, and a sense of peace permeated the grounds. Amy and I were sitting on a wooden bench overlooking a small lily pond, and then she arrived. Patricia Croft. But the woman walking toward us was not the Patricia Croft I once knew. She wasn't wearing dark designer clothes. She no longer had that cowed, fearful posture. Today, she wore a green knit dress. Her silver hair was cut in a stylish bob, and on her lips was a smile that, while still a bit shy, was completely genuine. She was no longer a shadow. She was a person. She sat down beside us. For a moment, the three of us were quiet, just listening to the wind rustling through the leaves. "My Phoenix Rising Foundation just received its first grant," Patricia said, breaking the silence. Her voice was still soft, but now it held a note of confidence. After Walter's arrest and the freezing of his assets, she had, with Leo Tanaka's help, claimed her share of the marital assets from their prenuptial agreement. And instead of using it to live a life of quiet luxury, she had started a foundation to help women who were victims of domestic abuse, both physical and psychological. "That's a beautiful name," Amy said, and she meant it. "Because we can all rise from the ashes," Patricia said, and she looked at me, then at Amy. "I owe you both an apology and a thank you." "You don't owe us anything, Patricia," I said. "We helped each other." We sat there, 3 women, 3 generations, 3 lives that had been damaged by the same men. We weren't friends in the traditional sense. There were too many painful memories between us for that. But we were allies. We were survivors, and together we had found a new kind of strength. Amy reached out and put her hand on Patricia's. "He sent lilies," she said softly, "the flowers of death." I smiled, a real, warm smile that came from my heart. But we chose to plant a garden instead. And it was true. From the rubble of a toxic family, we had cultivated something new, a garden of healing, of resilience, and of hope. The three of us, arm in arm, walked down the sun-drenched path of the Botanic Gardens, leaving the ghosts of the past behind us. The play was over, and our real lives now were just beginning. 2 years have passed since that sunny afternoon in the Botanic Gardens. Our lives have settled now, like the surface of the lake in Amy's painting, still and peaceful. Walter Croft died in prison a year ago of a heart attack. He died alone, with no family by his side. The empire he spent his life building with cruelty and lies crumbled into dust. His companies were broken up and sold off to pay his debts and compensate his victims, including the Tanaka family and my own daughter. His name, which he valued more than life itself, is now just a cautionary tale in Denver's business circles, a synonym for disgrace. He tried to bury his secrets at the bottom of a deep lake, but in the end, he was the one buried by their weight. Julian Croft, in exchange for a lighter sentence, cooperated with the prosecution and testified against his father. He sold out the man who made him to save his own cowardly skin. He received a 7-year sentence for complicity in covering up a crime and for the assault of Amelia. I hear that in prison, without his father's money and power to protect him, his polished good looks are worthless. He's just a number, a weakling in a world of true predators. He lost everything: his wife, his family, his fortune, and his freedom. He is a textbook example of a lesson I often taught my students. History can forgive ignorance, but it rarely forgives cowardice. Patricia, the woman I once thought was the weakest of them all, turned out to be the strongest. Her Phoenix Rising Foundation has become one of the most respected organizations in the city, helping hundreds of women and children escape violent environments. She transformed the pain of her 40-year life into the power to heal others. We still meet for tea sometimes. We don't talk much about the past. We talk about new projects, about the lives that have been saved. She found her purpose. She was truly reborn. Leo Tanaka finally got justice for his father. He won the civil suit against Walter Croft's estate, and he used the entire massive settlement to establish the Kenji Tanaka Scholarship Fund, which supports talented but underprivileged architecture students. He turned his family's tragedy into an opportunity for the next generation. He and Samuel have become good friends. They go fishing together sometimes, not to escape the past, but to enjoy the peace of the present. And as for us, Amy and me, we live in a small, cozy apartment near a park. Amy's career as an artist has flourished. Her paintings, so full of emotion and life, have touched the hearts of so many. She had her first, very successful solo exhibition. She is still single, but she isn't lonely. She has found love and fulfillment in her art, in her true friendships, and in herself. The scar on her temple has faded to a thin white line, almost invisible, but it's still there, a reminder not of the pain, but of the strength it took to overcome it. Every Sunday evening, we have a tradition. Amy cooks dinner, and I read to her while she cooks. Sometimes it's a classic novel, sometimes a book of poetry. Our little kitchen is once again filled with laughter and the smell of good food. They are simple, quiet moments, but to me, they are more precious than any fortune. Looking back on it all, I, an old history teacher, have learned one final lesson. History isn't just written by powerful men in closed boardrooms. It's also written by the quiet actions of ordinary people, by a mother who refused to give up, by a wife who dared to speak the truth, by a son who would never forget his father. Revenge, in the end, is a cold and empty meal, but justice, when it's served with intelligence and perseverance, is a warm fire. It doesn't just burn away the evil, it warms the souls that have been left in the cold for too long. I didn't choose violence. I chose history. I studied my enemy, I found their weaknesses, and I used their own past sins against them. And in the end, I won. Not by becoming like them, but by remaining who I am, a mother, a teacher, and someone who believes that even in the darkest pages of history, the light of truth will eventually shine through. And that, my dears, is the legacy I want to leave behind.